This week, I am joined by my good friend and Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer for Layered Insight, none other than Matt Alderman. As Michael Santarcangelo is on vacation, we Matt and I taking the reins of the show for this week. In the articles of discussion, 5 techniques to nail the marketing aspect of your investor pitch, 18 things you should know before you quit your job and launch your own startup for comedic value. This article is just gold. Spotify says 2 million people figured out how to block ads. So we'll talk about how that might play into your startup or your own software project and how to prevent people from circumventing controls. In Tracking Security Innovation segment, we've got BetterCloud. We've got ThreatX. RSA makes an acquisition. And more companies get funding and get acquired. So we'll talk about all those and more on this edition of Business Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show about security startups, how to secure your startup, and advice for security startups. It's Business Security Weekly.
I need it from the top.
Brought to you by... Are you getting pressure to improve your data security? Would you like a faster, easier, better way to patch? Then you need to check out Automox. Automox is a cloud-native platform that patches and manages every endpoint, even remote servers and devices, including Windows, Mac, Linux, and third-party software from a single dashboard. Improve your cyber hygiene, reduce your attack surface, and save 90% of the effort you spend patching. Automox, your patching system of record. Do you have a website, an external presence, employees, an office? Any of these things can be compromised and attacked. How are you defending your assets? Have you penetration tested your public assets? Start 2018 by taking a proactive approach to securing your vulnerable areas. Black Hills Information Security has been helping companies find their weaknesses since 2008. Email consulting at blackhillsinfosec.com and see how they can help you sleep better at night. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Business Security Weekly. As I stated, Michael Santarcangelo is on vacation this week, so Matt Alderman and myself will be hosting this week's show, and I'm super excited to welcome Matt to the show and talk about all of the fun topics we have prepared. Matt, welcome.
Thank you. Great Automox commercial. You know, I still advise them. So,
that's right.
I like that one. Yeah.
Yes. We like, Matt's an advisor to the show and helps out with hosting here. So we consult with Matt on what companies are actually solving problems for people that we want to promote to our audience. And of course, Matt and I used to work at Tenable Network Security together, and now Matt's at Layered Insight. And talk about insights that Matt has given us into the DevOps and container space. Has just been awesome, Matt. Our pre-show conversation was so DevOps nerdy. I love it.
Well, the AWS Summit this week in San Francisco was pretty amazing for a one-day free event, pulling over 8,000 people. It was a pretty interesting day. AWS just continues to push through service offerings that are just going to accelerate DevOps and containerization and all the other fun things. So yeah, it was a pretty interesting Wednesday downtown at Moscone West.
That's awesome. I have a question for you about that event. I just want to make sure we do any announcements that we have. I know that we will be at Source Boston May 9th through the 10th. I will be speaking actually about Docker security or insecurity, as it were. And so that's going to be fun. I'm actively researching for that presentation, which is cool. And we'll be there selling our Hack Naked gear. And there's even a discount code, which I don't have in front of me because I have too many things going on. I have 2 laptops and a keyboard. The discount code is SW75WMKW. Get you $75 off Source Boston this year. It's going to be a fun conference. Make sure you join us for that. And Social Engineering Conference will be happening here in Rhode Island, June 6th. se-ri.org is how you go register for that. So speaking of conferences, Matt, you were at a one-day free event that was put on by Amazon for AWS. Is that correct?
Yeah, so AWS is doing one-day summits around the world. I know there's one coming up in New York, Atlanta, in a number of other cities. I think Sydney's Australia's next week. So they're one-day events, kind of focused on just kind of educating primarily the developers. I mean, there's a number of security companies and security folks that are showing up to these events, but it's kind of this lead up to reInvent. It's this, how do they stay connected into the community, right, as you lead up to reInvent, which is in late November. And so just in San Francisco, it's one of the biggest, obviously. In like I said, there was somewhere north of 8,000 people for that one-day free event.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Matt. It kind of ties into some of the work we do here at Security Weekly, as we have our own internally developed software that has been morphing and changing, and that largely is the source of content for my talk at Source Boston. And we've migrated from not having containers and just having a monolithic application to putting it in Docker, to running it locally, to more recently putting it in AWS. And we haven't jumped into the Elastic Container Service, right, is ECS, where Amazon can actually host your containers. And that was largely due to just the learning curve. Like, it just, in the schedule, it didn't make sense. We had some local hardware fail, so we put it up in AWS, and then the next phase will be to move that into ECS, I think. And I think even a couple of years ago, people were kind of cautioning me that it's not quite ready. However, I think Amazon is actively working on that. And the reason, I think, for these one-day seminars is there has to be a lot of people in our same situation. They're like, I want to use ECS, and I go start reading the documentation, and the developers start reading the documentation, and we come back together and we're like, this requires a lot more planning and training than we have time for right now in the cycle. So let's move to the next phase and then continue researching and maybe attend one of these free events. So I think that all kind of came together for me.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing that most people need to realize is that AWS is actually making it easier every single day. At reInvent last year, they announced a new service called AWS Fargate, Fargate. And that session was packed, every single session. They did a hands-on workshop. They did a couple sessions on it. Lines were down the hall. And what's interesting about Fargate is it's a true serverless container as a service offering. So ECS is really a managed container service, and EKS will be a managed Kubernetes service, but it still requires you to manage the orchestration clusters and some of the hardware aspects, which is, it's kind of a pain in the butt, right? And I think this is one of the areas where people are really struggling. Now that Kubernetes has pretty much won the orchestration game, people are having problems rolling their own Kubernetes clusters, right? Yeah. Whether it's on-prem or what Fargate does is it abstracts the entire orchestration layer. Literally, what you do is you identify what containers make up tasks and services, you allocate memory and CPU to them, and launch them. And you don't have to worry about the cluster management. You don't have to worry about the host management. It is going to revolutionize the way people deploy. And the customer list since November that's already on Fargate was amazing. I mean, some big names have already moved their container platform and their container apps into Fargate.
Yeah, I like this as a strategy because, if you're a startup today and you're developing software, I mean, this is really new technology, but the benefits are just awesome. Serverless, I think, is really catching on, and I don't need to maintain all of that infrastructure anymore. I can just worry about my application. A lot of things are taken care of. I think once it gets tied into the marketplace, folks can just go buy your app, automatically spin up an environment for them. It's even easier than what we have available today, right? In terms of doing it traditionally in AWS. So this is certainly the future. Sounds like the present for a lot of companies. But it's just awesome technology.
Yeah, and it's the pricing that's really going to drive this. Is you only pay for the containers when they're running. You don't have to pay for the dedicated EC2 instances and the entire cluster, even though stuff may not be running or it may not be fully running. You don't have to worry about the bin packing problem anymore to optimize how many containers can run on different hosts, etc. It's literally, if the hosts are running, you get charged. If the hosts aren't running, you don't get charged. It will revolutionize the way people deploy container applications. It's something to watch.
Yeah, we were actually going through that in our own architecture in designing a way to say, well, when we need to do CPU compute intensive stuff, we just spin up some more containers to do that and then take them down. Like already that's in the design, I think, in most people's software today that are using containers, and it makes so much sense.
It does.
So we got a couple of articles to talk about today as well, including 5 techniques to nail the marketing aspect of your investor pitch. Very interesting. Matt and I have had lots of conversations about marketing as it relates to startup, as it relates to Security Weekly, as it relates to companies that we've worked for. And I thought some of the advice was sound, maybe not in the right order. They kind of put like, understand what your keywords are. And I think SEO is certainly a part of anyone's marketing strategy today. I think that also extends out into social media. But the next section talked about knowing your target audience. And for me, Matt, that's step one, right? Is you got to know who you're targeting. If you don't know who you're targeting, you can't do any marketing yet. Like that's step one.
Yeah, and this is where we've talked before about what I call the conversation roadmap. Understanding who the buyer is. What are their pain points and challenges? How do you solve those in a way that provides value, right? So knowing your target audience is super, super important, not only for your marketing plan, but also for the pitch, because you have to be able to articulate to the investors who you're selling to. Are you selling to development? You selling to operations? You selling to security? Those all have unique challenges, and if you're trying to sell to everybody without kind of focusing a little bit, it gets really, really hard to be successful.
It's one of the screening questions we actually ask of all our potential sponsors here in Security Weekly. In order for us to do quality work for you, we have to understand who you're trying to target and with what message. If you don't know that, probably not ready to work with us yet, right? Because we have got a network of shows and we understand messaging and positioning. So, you got to tell me what companies you're targeting, the personas that you're targeting, what problem you're solving, and how you're messaging and positioning around, that foundation. And once you have all that together, then we can say, okay, we think these activities will be the most beneficial to you to reach your target audience with a message that, and in our case, the end result is to get someone to take an action. And I think all of your marketing activities, well, maybe not all, but most of them, I think should compel people to take some action. And for me, that's kind of the final step. Like once you've defined all of that, what action do you want people to take? Do you want them to register for a demo? Do you want them to just go purchase your product? I mean, it depends largely on what you're selling. But that action, I mean, we call it call to action. I hate that term, but you want them to do something. When they see an ad on Facebook or when they listen to a webcast or whatever your marketing activity is, has to lead them on a journey that ultimately ends up in them taking some action.
Yeah, right. I mean, the purpose of marketing is to identify potential prospects, nurture them, and turn them into leads so you can try to sell to them. I mean, that's just marketing 101. So all these activities that you're doing, whether it's a campaign or an advertisement or whatever, you're trying to convince them to take an action in some form or fashion. And they can vary, but that's what you're trying to do. But you better put them in the right place so you keep them. Because if what you're saying in your article or in your ad doesn't link to something logical on your website, then they get confused. And so, as you have seen, I'm a big believer in kind of mapping those out so that I know which campaigns take prospects to the right places on a web page so that they get maximum value and then continue that journey.
And, speaking of value, one of the things the article says is to communicate your budget and your marketing spend to your investors. And I think there's kind of like a narrow scope, right? And I think that if you're pitching to an investor and you're like, oh, we're not going to spend any money on marketing. And then the other end of the spectrum is, well, we're going to spend all this money on marketing. Be prepared to defend that position. And some of it ties back to what Matt just said, being able to recognize a return on investment from your different marketing activities and know what's working well for you and doing more of it, or doing something slightly different if you've already exhausted that avenue, if you feel like. But communicating the value of your marketing spend to your investors, I think, is probably one of the most important things in terms of budgeting.
It is. It typically shows up as a pretty big line item when you think about your budget plan and how you're going to spend the investment dollars, sales and marketing is a big chunk,
Sure.
and R&D is a big chunk,
Yep.
right? And so you have to be able to defend those spends. If it's all R&D, then the investor is going to be like, well, how are you going to generate leads, right? If it's all sales and marketing, then what do you need to do to propel the product through the next stages? So there is a balance between those two numbers. But look, the investors are going to dig into them, and you're going to have to be able to justify what's in there.
The next article is about branding. And I added this article basically because when we've talked about the Play Bigger book and creating your category, they really poo-poo a lot of traditional branding efforts, Matt. So I was wondering your thoughts and opinions on maybe some of the books here and the overall general view of branding, today in the marketplace, especially as it relates to security.
Yeah, this gets a little interesting, right? I haven't read some of these books. I kind of read through some of the abstracts of the titles, right? Branding's interesting in general, right? You've got to come up with that kind of category point of view that you want, but then you have to build this brand around that. And, there are some traditional components. I'm still kind of traditional in some respects. Digital marketing has its place and drives generation and leads and some other things, but people are going to look for a little more substance sometimes. And so, I really think about brand and theme and how you want to portray yourself as a company out there. And so, yeah, you can't just create a category and walk away and go, yep, I'm done, right? That's it. We're good. We created the category, so now let the dollars flow in. No, you still have to create a brand. You have to educate the market. You have to bring people to your point of view. You have to educate them on that, and then sell them on the value. And that's some of the things. A couple of the books don't go into depth. These books go in there a little bit, and it's really kind of merging the two together, which is the interesting art/science.
But I think that traditionally, what I found when people think of branding, they think of it in that phrase, which I'm not a huge fan of, that is, I want to get my name out there. And I'm like, yeah, that's not good enough. But what Matt said was, get people on board with your point of view. Now you're on to something, right? They have to know who you are, sure. But a very close follow-on to that I think needs to come together is get them on board with my point of view. What do I believe the problem is, and what do I believe the best way to solve that problem is? And that's when we work with our sponsors. That's what I like to convey in kind of the branding portion of our services is not just getting your name out there, but what problem do you solve, and then what's your point of view on that problem, and make sure that that's in your branding in some way, shape, form, or fashion. I mean, sure, that can tie to your name, that can tie to your logo, can tie to your tagline, but giving a little bit of information, traditionally we'd call that messaging and positioning, right? Giving them a little bit of that with your branding, I think, is really important.
Yeah, exactly, right? Just because you created a category that, nobody may know about, you have to position it in, it's still back to what the buyer is trying to solve. He's got a problem. He's looking for a solution. So you have to be able to articulate that and put your spin on it. This is, we've seen companies do this well. We've seen companies not do this well, but it's got to be more than just, ta-da, I'm here. That's it.
Right. Yeah,
I'm done.
Exactly.
Right? No.
Exactly. I think that the next article really kind of speaks to that a little bit too, because if you're creating your own startup, or maybe you've gone to work for a startup, this article, it says 18 things you need to know before you quit your job and launch your own startup. Is really some of the struggles they talk about in this article is about communicating what you're doing, communicating your brand, communicating your point of view and your problem, and making people understand that. And oftentimes when you just go launch a startup, you're still developing that. You're still developing your product. You're still trying to define your problem and define the ways in which you communicate that problem and solution out into the marketplace. So when you tell your parents, as the number one example, your parents think this is a phase that you're going to get over, right? Like, hey, I just quit my job and I'm going to work for this startup now. And, the next logical question is like, well, what do you do? And you may still be figuring some of that stuff out, and that's okay. Number two is your friends don't get it either, right? Your friends are like, hey, you went to work for this startup. Well, what do you guys do? Well, you come up with this big, long explanation, and they're like, I don't get it. And I think that's a maturity point for your messaging, right? If you can tell your friends and family what you do and they get it, you might be onto something with your marketing and messaging.
Well, I've been in security for over 20 years, and my wife still has no idea what I do.
No idea.
So
right? Yeah.
I must be bad at least explaining it to her because she still doesn't get it.
Right. There's some other fun things in here too. Your job will be hard to explain. You'll be overworked and underpaid, and I think that's certainly a perception of startups, right? Sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, I think there's there's some interesting ones in here, and you just hit on one, right? People think startups are fun. I mean, they are if you're in the right mindset. If you're a guy that's done 9 to 5 in corporate America and think coming to a startup means I get to work 9 to 5 and have all this fun with new technology, think again, okay? You don't work a 9 to 5 job.
Nope.
You're working 10, 12 plus hours a day, 6, maybe sometimes 7 days a week, right? I mean, startups are a lot of work. And if you come in with the attitude that, you're going to get the same salary. No, startups have limited budgets.
Mm-hmm.
Salaries are not the same when you come to a startup. So there's a lot of people that, want to get into startups but haven't been here before. And you have to realize it's longer days, it's longer hours, it's more days, and it's less pay. These are just some of the realities. My parents haven't cared what I've been doing for years personally. So, I don't have to worry about explaining it to my parents. But sometimes your wife and your kids are like, well, what is that you do? Why do you have to go to California, every week or every other week? But yeah.
I think you have to, one of the things I think it comes down to is you have to be really comfortable with risk, right? And realize that you're working towards a goal. And if it goes well, things are going to go well for you, right? You're going to get acquired, you're going to get funded, you're going to start turning a profit. There's a lot of work that leads up to that, but it's very risky. And you're putting in a lot of time and effort and energy to something that really hasn't quite taken off yet. And there's a lot of risk involved with that. So, and you have to be comfortable with that. You can't be the type of person that's like, oh, that's too risky. I don't know if I want to put that much time into, this part or the other. You have to make informed decisions and run with them. And just be comfortable with risk.
Yeah, exactly. Because 90+% of these companies are going to fail.
Yeah,
they are. They may not get initially funded. They may get funded, but then the exit's not good. We'll talk about one of those later in the news articles. There is a ton of risk here, and if you are not willing to take on some of that risk, startups are not the easiest thing for people. I love it because, look, I love the space. I love new technology, love trying to solve these problems. But look, there's a lot of risk in what you do every single day. So be ready for it.
Yeah, I also think this extends out into if you have your own company today or you're working for a company and you want to start a new initiative, many of these new initiatives are almost like startups and you have the same considerations. And it might be risky to embark on this new venture, this new service, this new product from an already established company. Now, there's a little less risk because you've already established a business and hopefully you're making money. And now you're going to take some of that and invest it into something new to expand and or pivot. There's risk in that too. And maybe you want to try that first before you go start your own startup, is maybe inside of your role today, come up with some kind of new initiative and try and see that through. And a lot of those initiatives fail. I mean, we could talk for a long time, even just in security, about companies that have created a new product or service and it just hasn't taken off, right? And to me, that's kind of a form of a startup within an existing organization.
Yeah, exactly. And there's good places. The Googles and the Amazons of the world, man, they love to spin up new projects internally. If you're working for one of those companies, it gives you that great entrepreneurial spirit and really prepares you for, maybe going out on your own and doing it. That's why you see a ton of people from Google and Amazon, starting companies because they get to experience aspects of that internally.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're working for a Fortune 500, that may or may not exist. And trust me, it's a very different environment on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. GFI Software has launched a different type of subscription model, and I've seen this story come up a number of times, and they're certainly targeting the mid-market. What was your take on this, Matt, as you and I have had lots of conversations about how to spin up new services and package them for the, especially for the security market?
Yeah, this one's not really new to me because I look at it and go, okay, they're providing an unlimited bundle on a per user basis. I don't think that's really new.
Mm.
See, new to me would be like a consumption model. You pay for what you use and you get billed for it. That's kind of the leading edge from a pricing perspective. I didn't really see anything new in here. They're just bundling all their packages together in an unlimited per user based pricing. That's not new.
There is a pricing model that I thought was new, and I want to get your take on it from a startup that I've been speaking with that I'm really impressed with. And when I asked them about their pricing and packaging, and of course everyone gets a little funny when you ask them about price, and I'm like, all right, if you don't want to tell me the price, that's fine. I get it, but tell me how you package it. How do I buy it? Do I buy it on a per user basis? Is it a price per packet, a price for storage? Like, what is it? And the most innovative one I've seen lately, Matt, is they said, well, our cost to our customers is 1% of their security budget. And I'm like, well, hold on, back up a second. You have to trust that they're telling you what their actual security budget is. And then their pricing model is basically, we're 1% of your security budget. I was like, wow, that's interesting. Certainly new. I don't know if you've seen those kind of models before, Matt, but I thought that was interesting.
I haven't seen that model, and I don't know if that's good or bad yet.
Right.
Because look, security doesn't necessarily get the budget that the rest of the IT team does, right?
Sure.
It's probably, on average, 4% of the IT budget. I think you just limited your market scope a little bit by trying to charge 1% of a 4% budget. And again, what's the value for that 1%? That's the interesting question for me, is because you have to articulate value in your pricing too. Mm-hmm. And if you're not managing the overall security portfolio or reducing costs across all of it, man, that's a hard pricing model to justify.
Yeah. So this article, "Don't Let Taxes Kill Your New Business," I thought was kind of interesting, given it's tax season. My best advice, Matt, and I don't know what your advice is with taxes and as it comes to startups or starting a new business, is my advice is always just get a good accountant. And don't get just any accountant. Shop around to accountants that have experience helping new businesses or startups, or maybe accounting firms that cater to startups in security or in technology. They're best positioned to help you. No one, if you're running a startup or in technology in any kind of role, like tax expert is a far cry from looking at network packets or any kind of other expertise. And my advice is always to get a qualified accountant, because tax laws are constantly changing, and there are decisions in there that can really either help or greatly hurt your business if it's not established correctly from the beginning.
Agreed. So I having done a few of these, there are a couple probably tips here that I definitely take a look at. Right, income tax, to me, if you're going to do this, you build an S corp. You bring the money over on a K1 to your personal taxes. You pay at your personal tax rate versus a C corp. Right, mm-hmm. That's how I do it. I've got 2 of them. I don't have employees. Right. For a specific reason, because employment taxes get expensive. You know this, right? Having the Security Weekly stuff. I like 1099s because I don't have to pay employee taxes, or they're partners in the business, right? Mm-hmm. So I've avoided employees in my small businesses just for that reason. If you file as an S corp, you avoid self-employment taxes versus being self-employed, mm-hmm. so you don't get the double whammy. So that's why I always recommend, if you're going to do an LLC, file it as an S corp with the IRS in the timelines you have to, so you're recognized that way. You'll have to file your 1120S, and then you take your K1 and put it on your personal, but it will reduce some of the double taxation. So those are just simple tips that I've had to deal with over the years. So, well,
in the C corp too, and again, I'm not a tax expert, right? But I've read some of the advice from folks, and in the startup world, they actually some people recommend that you start off with a C corp. Now, that may help you in funding, sure, and I think if your goal is to do this startup and put in 7 days a week, and that's what you're doing, and your goal is to get funding early on, that is what some are recommending. Again, I don't want to be your tax consultant, right? I'm just saying what some people have recommended. And some of the downsides are that double taxation that's associated with the C corp, because you will pay a little more in taxes. However, what some experts have said, when you go to investors is they're looking for that C Corp to already be created as kind of like a little checkbox before they invest. So it's always best to do your homework, talk to your advisors. Maybe if you're going to get funding like right out of the gate, maybe talk to your investors and say, what do you look for in a company and how it's set up, especially tax-wise and corporation filings? What do you look for? And base your decisions on that. And it's going to be different for everyone.
Yeah, it is. But if you're going to go get funding, I can almost guarantee you're going to open it as a Delaware C Corp.
Yep.
I mean, that is almost table stakes.
Yeah.
If you're going out and getting investment and you're going to build out the company.
Yep. So I added this next one in here about Spotify. They've kind of been in the news lately about, basically their revenue model as it relates to ads and premium services. So in the first story that came before this one, they figured out that people were able to cheat the system and get, premium services without paying. Now they've also come out and said that people have figured out how to block ads as well within their software. And they've got this problem that, Matt, you and I have dealt with, and many of us in the security that you've worked for a company or started a company have dealt with. How do you prevent abuse of your product and circumventing controls that you put in? And let's face it, security has that problem in a big way because our audience, a large percentage of them are essentially hackers. And if there's a way around it, they're going to find it. And Spotify, I think, is suffering from this in a big way. Now, Spotify's a big company today, and so they have this problem at scale. How do you recommend, Matt, that you deal with some of these issues, especially early on, and not having, potential customers rip you off, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, there's two potential mistakes that happen here, right? One is you give away everything for free, and then you realize, oh, shoot, I have to figure out how to get customers to grow their revenue. So, one recommendation is don't start with a unlimited full offering because it's really hard to peel that back. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to create additional revenue when you've given everything away up front. On the flip side of that, then it's on these free offerings, right? What do you give away for free? And then how do you drive upsell into a paid product, right? So Spotify gives away, aspects of their service for free, but you get a bunch of ads, and the ads compensate Spotify for this.
And also, Matt, Spotify in their free offering, because I'm an audiophile, I researched this, their free offering is a much lower quality. And if you pay the money in subscription, which I do, you get a much higher quality. Because I have a headphone fetish and I've been an audiophile like my whole life essentially. So that's one of the ways they're differentiating.
Right. And so from a security perspective, you have to think the same thing. You're going to give away a free product. Well, how much of that functionality do you give away for free? And then where do you draw those lines to get somebody enticed to actually pay for a product, right? And so you've seen freemium offerings from others. When I was at Qualys, we did this with Scan, right? It was limited to a certain number of devices. It kind of got you hooked. That allowed you to move into a paid product that gave you more capabilities. Tenable did this with Nessus Home. Again, pretty limited, gave you the opportunity to move into Nessus and the enterprise product. So there's ways to construct your offerings that allow you to do free. But you got to think about all the licensing, packaging aspects of that early on so that you can enforce functionality early in the product to give you that packaging capability. It's always hard to retrofit licensing later into some of these products, especially as they started as like, I'll give you everything for one price, and then you figure out how to break it up and enhance it and charge differently for it. So
there's the open
things
there's the open source model too. Which are varying degrees. In active countermeasures, for example, we've got a version of our product, and it's a portion of the paid one that's free and open source. And you let people go and install that, and then when they want more, they move into a paid product. And we've seen that a lot in security. Today, one of my projects that I've been working on and will continue to work on is OSSec, which is an Alien Vault open source project. And, that's kind of interesting to see how these companies have maintained. Of course, Tenable long ago made that decision that open source, that just wasn't the model that they wanted to go down and, abandon that open source model. Other companies have kept that open source model and kept the version of the product open source. The question becomes, like what do you open source and how much functionality is there versus your commercial product, I think that's the real balancing act.
Yeah, and in a perfect example from we started earlier is Docker, right? Docker Community Edition, widely adopted.
Yep.
Docker Enterprise Edition, what's the difference, right? Well, there's enterprise features. But look, Red Hat's done a really good job of taking the open source CE version of Docker and building a commercial product around
it.
And because everybody uses the open source, it gets adopted pretty fast, right? So there are models, and Red Hat's a really good example of this, of how you can leverage open source and build commercial products around it. They're probably one of the best examples out there. So if you're looking at that model, go figure out what's made Red Hat successful, because that's the model you should probably try to copy.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that drives people to get a commercial product versus open source is, well, for one, you get to play with the features, but that's oftentimes a lot of work. Like when I'm playing with OSSec, like I have to go read the documentation, install each agent by hand, and sure, there's other open source scripts that allow me to deploy agents, but it's a lot of reading, it's a lot of manual configuration. When you switch to the commercial products, oftentimes a lot of that stuff is automated. A lot of that stuff they'll send people out when you purchase the product to help you configure it and get it set up, and that's just included in the cost. So a lot of it is that maintenance and deployment that is kind of the first step of nice services that you get by actually paying for the product. And of course, a lot of people do the open source model, and I like to think of that as kind of a proving ground, right? If I can go prove that it works, and I'm like, hey, look at the benefits we get. And by the way, if we wanted to roll this out to the whole organization, we can go get a commercial product, commercially supported. And it's not just for support. When I look at the difference between open source and commercial products, I'm not looking for necessarily someone to pick up the phone and call. I think that's kind of a lame excuse. What I'm looking for is the commercial product has a product manager or a team of product managers that are balancing and implementing features and having influence over what features are being built in to solve my problems. And I think that's the real benefit to a commercial product. I think people think of it as I can pick up the phone and call someone. We've all had our support experiences, right? I think the real benefit is the management of those features and the development process and product management. Do you agree, Matt?
Yeah, in documentation and all the other things that go along with running commercial products, right? You have a team that is definitely trying to figure out how to enhance it for their customers and for new customers, prospects. And so they're going to listen, right? And they're going to figure out how to add some of these features for you. When you're in just pure open source, you're kind of at the mercy of the community of whatever they feel like adding to the open source version. So yes, commercial versions definitely have more focus on feature functionality roadmap than the open source will.
And what I found, and I talked about it in my presentation at InfoSec World when you talked about documentation, Matt, is when you're in open source world reading the documentation, I've experienced, and everyone was nodding their heads in agreement when I explained this too, is that you get some pretty good documentation on how to like download, install the software and some maybe initial configuration. And then as you go through the documentation, you'll find how to do this like really super cool thing to find this really new and interesting event in your network or super technical thing. But like everything else in the middle is missing. Like, how do I deploy it out and maintain it and get all these features and tie all the pieces together? Like everything in between is missing in open source. You got to figure that out on your own, which, I mean, that's the nature of open source. When you go to commercial products, I think when we say better documentation is you get that full suite of guidance, right? From installation to deployment, to tying all the pieces together, and also some of the advanced stuff as well.
Yeah, and the integration, right? Instead of just this kind of Swagger page by itself, you actually get some information about what those APIs are actually doing.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, that's definitely more important.
Awesome. All right. So with that, we're going to take a short break, come back and talk about tracking security innovation, acquisitions, and funding rounds for security companies coming up next.